China's evil acts, Justin Trudeau's major missteps, the gamble to shut down the global economy, and authoritarian elites cracking down on our freedom. Hello from self-quarantine. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. We are doing a live broadcast today for several reasons, partially just because everyone is in self-isolation and self-quarantine, so I didn't want to have the team go into our True North office. I thought it'd be a lot easier to just record my show live. You know, I'm in a room by myself. I can't possibly get anyone sick or have anyone get me sick, which is the major concern right now. I think it is probably pretty prudent advice for people to be self-isolating, just given what we know about this virus and how quickly and how easily it can spread. That being said, though, I think that a lot of the measures that are being implemented and being suggested are pretty scary, that if they had been suggested or tried to be implemented under any other circumstances, we would be crying from the rooftop, demanding that our freedoms be upheld. But because there is this health crisis and because nobody really knows, we don't have the full information. We don't have the full picture. We still are learning more and more about this disease. It's better to just be cautious and stay at home. So let me know where you're watching this broadcast from. Let me know whether you're taking the quarantine seriously and whether you are yourself in self-isolation or whether you're still going about your day-to-day, whether your job permits you to work at home or whether you can, or whether you still have to go out into the workforce, whether you still have to commute and go into the office. I guess it depends on where you live. I think that the approach so far in Canada has been fairly good, that it's sort of the provinces that are taking the lead and, not the federal government that's saying, we're in a state of emergency and everyone has to stay at home. Because to be perfectly honest, if you live in Toronto like I do, and there is a major outbreak, or if you live in Vancouver where we know that there has been a major outbreak, you're probably going to be a lot more cautious than, say, if you live, on the Sunshine Coast in British Columbia, or if you live in northern Alberta, or if you live somewhere more rural where you're not really that likely to interact with people. I think it really does depend on where you live. But as we know, this virus travels fast and easily, and people can get infected and carry it everywhere. I think every single province now has reported cases of this thing. So there's been a lot of talk recently about what we should be calling this thing. I talked about this on my broadcast, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now. Oh no, sorry, it was last week, where I criticized Donald Trump for calling it the China virus. He retweeted Charlie Kirk, who called it the China virus, and I thought that they were being sort of unnecessarily provocative. And sometimes conservatives do this thing where they sort of almost pretend to be ignorant, but they're really doing it on purpose. And I kind of cringed at that. So I felt like, we should try to call things what they are. This flu originated in Wuhan. It is, everyone knew about it because it was hitting this city called Wuhan, which, to be perfectly honest, most people had never heard of Wuhan before the actual Wuhan virus. So, we should try to use words that are the most accurate as possible. China is a huge, massive country with over 1 billion people. It happened in a very specific part of China. So I thought, we should call it the Wuhan virus rather than the China virus. I'll admit it. I've kind of had a change of heart. I think that China is an incredibly bad actor on the world stage, and we're learning more and more and more about how they suppressed this illness, how they tried to cover it up, how the massive missteps that they made at the beginning when this news was just first coming out of this virus really caused long-term damage. If it wasn't for China, this thing wouldn't have even existed. So sure, I think we should call it the China virus. I think that people who are getting up in arms right now over political correctness, the World Health Organization said that it was unfair and it caused stigma. Look, it's not the Chinese people's fault. It is the Chinese government's fault. It is the communist Chinese government's fault. And, if we want to call this the Chinese virus to put stigma and to put pressure on the government to stop doing these kind of things in the future, to crack down on these wet markets, which seems to be the origin of this virus, then I think that's good enough reason for the international community to come together. Instead, we have these sort of nagging left-wing voices saying, don't call it that, call it COVID-19, which is a technical term. It's an acronym. It just stands for coronavirus disease. And then 19 is the year that it originated 2019. That's not really like the way that people use language colloquially. We usually describe something that helps us understand what it is. So the Wuhan virus, everyone knows it originated in Wuhan. I would be for calling it the Chinese bat virus or the Wuhan bat virus, so that the connotation, do not eat bats, do not handle bats. It's a very, very bad idea for human beings to be touching and eating bats. That should be very, very basic knowledge. But we should use terms that mean something. And coronavirus is a general term to describe a type of disease, so it's not specific at all to what is happening here. Again, I'll admit when I think I said something that is wrong, and I do think I was wrong before to criticize Trump for saying the China virus, because I do think China is a bad actor, and we're learning more and more about this. A report that came out yesterday found that China could have reduced this outbreak by 95% if they had acted earlier, if they had acted sooner. So the research found that if interventions in China could have been conducted just 1 week earlier, 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks earlier, cases could have been reduced by 66%, 86%, or 95%, significantly limiting the geographical spread of this disease. So all the Chinese government had to do was act quickly, be honest about what was happening, and crack down on this. But of course, because it's China, it's a communist dictatorship, that's not what they did. They tried to cover it up. They lied about what it was. They didn't allow information to leave the country. They cracked down on individuals who were trying to blow the whistle. They cracked down on journalists who were trying to report on this thing. And because of those decisions, we now have a global pandemic, a global health emergency that will probably kill thousands and thousands of people. Well, it already has killed thousands and thousands of people, will probably kill many, many more. And it's all because of China's decision to keep this under wraps. So even after Chinese President Xi Jinping personally ordered officials to control the outbreak on January 7th, authorities in China kept denying it could spread between humans, something doctors had known had been happening since late December. And they went ahead with a Chinese Lunar New Year banquet involving tens of thousands of families in Wuhan. So that one decision to allow that lunar banquet involving tens of thousands of families in Wuhan really is what led to the massive outbreak. The Chinese government lied about it. They knew that it was something that could be transmitted from humans. They've known about it since 2019, possibly as early as November 2019, and yet they lied about it. They lied about it. They continued to say that we should be able to, that people in China should be able to just go about their regular lives. And because of that, we have a huge global pandemic. So we should blame China. We should call it as it is. This is their fault. And they continued to crack down on journalists who are trying to report the truth. They continued to push propaganda and lies. So no, we shouldn't avoid calling it the China virus just because we want to stop the stigma. Now, of course, this isn't saying that Chinese individuals are to blame. No, it's the government of China. This isn't, the two things are separate. Just like you can criticize, the government of Iran and call that an evil regime without somehow saying that all of the people of Iran are at fault, or saying that you hate the people of Iran. No, you hate the government of Iran. Same thing with China. So again, really, really disheartening stuff. And in the midst of all this, we learn that Canada is sending aid to China. Canada gave 16 tons of medical supplies to China. This is in the Toronto Sun. My colleague Anthony Fury, on February 9th, Global Affairs Canada announced that to support China's ongoing response to the outbreak, Canada has developed approximately 16 tons of personal protective equipment, such as clothing, face shields, masks, goggles, gloves, and has given it to the country since February 2020. Canada's first case was identified on January 25th. And by that time, we started shipping equipment to China. We'd already had 5 confirmed cases. So why is Canada giving aid to China? Like, China is, by most accounts, a way bigger country than Canada. Their GDP is almost 8 times bigger than ours. And they are the reason why this disease is here. Canada itself might not have the capacity. We are struggling and really concerned that in a couple weeks' time, if the growth of this virus continues in the exponential manner that we've seen, that we won't have enough medical equipment. And yet we're sending resources to China, the regime, the country that started all this. It's just absolutely mind-boggling, hard to understand. Thanks everyone who's watching live right now. Again, let me know where you're watching from. Let me know if you're doing self-quarantine and if you buy into the whole idea that we all have to stay at home and we can't go outside, what you think about all of this. I think that there's almost kind of a generational divide. My own parents who live in North Vancouver aren't really taking this very seriously. Every time I try to send them articles and kind of encourage them to stay inside, they kind of like just no, they're not interested. My dad is still going golfing every day that he can, that there's not frost on the course, which, of all the places you could be going, I guess a golf course is pretty isolated and you're not exactly interacting with a lot of people. But still, I mean, if you're in that high risk group, which my dad and stepmom are, I certainly would be cautious. I'm not even in that risk group and I'm pretty paranoid. I haven't left the house in over a week. And I think that it's probably a good idea to at least self-isolate. Okay, I want to talk about Justin Trudeau and his response. So, everyone's sort of praising him for giving these daily updates, addressing the country, and staying calm in this time of sort of chaos. I think that there have been some major missteps, though, that the Trudeau government has done, and I want to talk about those now. I think that it's good that they've finally closed the borders, although there's just so many exemptions that it's hard to really say they've closed the borders. Like they said, okay, the borders closed to all non-citizens, non-permanent residents, but then they included Americans in there at first, and then they also included like airline staff and all these other groups. And then we found out that if you cross the border illegally and claim asylum, you're also still allowed to stay and come into Canada, which is just sort of contradictory of the whole idea that we don't want foreign nationals. Then they closed the border to the United States, except for there were all these exemptions for anyone doing trade, anyone shipping. Obviously, we don't want to disrupt the supply lines, especially when so many people are desperate to get out and get the supplies, get the food that they need, the groceries. There's been a lot of shortages. I know my husband went out to the Loblaws up the street last night and he said that the shelves were pretty empty. There was no dairy whatsoever in the store. All the eggs, milk, everything was gone. So obviously we don't want to disrupt the supply lines in Canada and America and the US. Our economies are so integrated. But still, I think that the fact that Trudeau is just doing this now, just finally coming around to the fact that we should close our border and really take this seriously, it's just, it's almost too late. Other countries were doing it a week, 2 weeks earlier. We saw what happened in Italy. Italy should have been like a big wake-up call to everyone in the West. The other countries that had been hit prior were all sort of secretive, closed, authoritarian regimes. I'm talking about China and Iran. There was also South Korea and other countries that are a little bit more open in Asia. But really what happened in Italy was a glimpse at, wow, this is what happens in a free Western society. Their healthcare was absolutely overrun. People didn't take the warning seriously at first until it was kind of too late. And there was just so many sick people that they just couldn't feasibly handle it all. And the healthcare system was really beginning to crumble. It was sort of scary. And if you've read any of the articles written by doctors or people that were at the hospitals, it just seems like a very, very chaotic scene. And so at that point, it was pretty obvious that we should shut down our borders and implement some kind of a self-isolation regime. The Trudeau government said, no, borders can't stop this disease. And so they continue to leave them open. And even within Canada, once they made the edict to close the borders and to say non-citizens and non-permanent residents can't come, they still said that it was okay to travel within Canada. Well, part of the problem is that when you're experiencing an outbreak in Toronto and Vancouver, and then you tell Canadians like, hey, you can still travel as you wish within Canada, what you're going to do is take the viruses that are in those two cities and spread them throughout the country. And that is exactly what we have seen. There was a large dental conference in Vancouver on March 5th through 7th, where about 20,000 people were in attendance, and they've identified that some cases came from that dental conference and have now been spread all around Canada. There's cases, like I said, in every single province. So why wouldn't the Trudeau government have locked down all travel? At that point, we know that that's how the virus spreads. It spreads from people who travel and then come back to a new community. That's how it travels. And so the idea that even at the time, the government was saying, go ahead and travel within Canada, I think was a grave mistake and helped the spread. And that's part of the reason why we have the huge growth in Canada. So I guess we can give Trudeau credit for now finally taking some steps towards closing the borders, but really, I think it could have easily been, these decisions could have easily been made 2 weeks ago, and Canadians would have been a lot more safe. Let me know what you think, whether you think that the Canadian government should have closed the border earlier, whether you think we should be in total isolation, or whether you think this whole thing is overblown. And there's one thing I want to talk about. I feel like even though I personally am taking a lot of measures to stay safe, to keep distance from people, especially, I think, I don't really want to go and see my in-laws because I worry about their health. They're a little bit older. I wouldn't go into a grocery store at this point. In case you can't tell, I'm a little under the weather. I'm a little congested, and I had a little bit of a fever earlier in the week. So I wouldn't take any risks at all in leaving the house. Even within my house, I try to keep distance from my family that are here so that I can avoid getting other people sick. But I think that, a lot of the questions, when you watch the media briefings that are happening, a lot of the questions from journalists keep going towards, should we start fining people? Should we start arresting people who are not listening to the advice to self-quarantine, to self-isolate? And I think that there's like a little bit of an authoritarian impulse that so many people, especially in the media and in the government, have. First of all, they think that we should all be ruled by experts, so-called experts. The problem is that experts are often wrong. And, who are the experts? Who are the ones that we're talking about? It usually comes down to government employees. So we're talking about government kind of having control top down over everybody, that their decisions stand. What about the idea that you might be able to challenge an expert, or that someone who claims to be an expert might not be the most knowledgeable person on that topic? I think that there's a lot of concern, and I do think there's an authoritarian impulse. I'm going to show a bit of an interview, a part of an interview that really kind of highlights this. It really brought it home. So this is from CNN, and Jake Tapper is the host. He had the health expert, his name is Sanjay, Dr. Sanjay, and they were talking about how San Francisco is on a 24-hour lockdown. They have had a major outbreak, and so because of that, they're really taking this seriously, basically ordering everyone to stay home, and the only people that can leave are people that work in essential services like health, people who are delivery drivers, and people that are going out to get medical attention or groceries. The mayor of San Francisco did say, of course you can go out and get fresh air. You can walk your dog, you can go for a jog, that kind of thing. Because really telling people to stay home, it's one thing if you live in a rural area, or if you live in a house, you live in the suburbs like me, there's space, you can go in your backyard and stuff. If you live in the city though, if you live in a little apartment and you have a dog, you can't tell someone to just stay inside. So people have to be able to go outside. So Jake Tapper and this medical expert were on CNN, and they were watching a clip of San Francisco, the Embarcadero, which is the main sort of strip along the water. And it's 5:30 p.m., so right when everyone's finished work, it shows a clip of people walking, people jogging, people holding their hands. And Jake Tapper is just so furious. He's so mad that these people are actually outside. Like, how dare they be outside? So let's watch this clip, and then I'll give some feedback about it.
What needs to happen in this country is we need to break the cycle of transmission of this virus. And it doesn't look like that's happening right now. And I'm worried these numbers keep going up. And they're going to go up because of the testing, but I think they're going to go up as well because this virus continues to spread.
And look, I mean, the mayor said to me that people are allowed, if they need to go out and get go for a walk and get a breath of fresh air, they're allowed to, as long as they social distance. But that's not what we just saw. We saw people going for jogs, people going about their life as if it's normal. We're being told by the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health that this is not normal. First of all, we see a whole bunch of people here who are not distancing. They're holding hands and walking down the street. And, normally I'd say bravo. But this is actually kind of enraging. The people of San Francisco, or I shouldn't say the people, but many people in San Francisco have clearly not gotten the message.
So there you have it. Jake Tapper is enraged. He is enraged at the fact that people in San Francisco, look at what you can see, maybe 10 people. You can see 10 people out. He's enraged by that. And he's enraged by the fact that they're holding hands. People are holding hands. Okay, let me just say a couple things. First of all, I used to live close to this area. I used to live in San Francisco. I spent 2 years living there. I lived a few blocks from where this is taken. At 5:30 on a weekday, this is usually packed. Like I used to ride my bicycle along here. I used to go jogging every day on this path, and you would usually have a hard time even moving. There are parts where you actually have to go onto the road to jog because you couldn't get through. It was so packed with people. So what I'm seeing here is a huge reduction in the number of people. Second of all, these people are social distancing. You know, you can go for a walk. There's not that many places to really go for a nice walk in San Francisco. It's a pretty disgusting, junky city filled with just, lots of just garbage everywhere, needles everywhere, feces everywhere, tent cities everywhere. One of the few nice places to go for a walk is along the waterfront. And so that's where a lot of people go rather than walking through the streets. So the fact that people are going out, they're not really clustering close to each other. From best we know from the science so far is that you get this disease by sort of prolonged presence in front of someone. If someone's sick and you spend like 5-10 minutes sitting with them, that's how you're most likely to get sick. That's why airplanes, movie theaters, restaurants are a big concern, because you're sitting next to someone breathing in the same air and you could potentially touch something they've touched. Walking by someone on the waterfront, interacting with them for maybe half a second as you walk by each other, that's not when you're going to be at risk. And also the fact that he's getting angry that people are holding hands. Well, newsflash to Jake Tapper and people who criticize others for holding hands. People that hold hands together are usually in some kind of a relationship together, and they usually probably even live together. So the fact that if me and my husband want to go for a walk out on the street, us holding hands, that's not how we're going to provide, give each other the virus. It's more likely going to be, the fact that we share a bed together and that we eat all of our meals together and that we live in the same household. So really the raging at people for not specifically following the quarantine, and how dare you go for a walk and get fresh air? How dare you hold hands with your spouse during a time of national crisis? I mean, I think that a lot of people have like an inner dictator, an inner authoritarian. And when they get put in positions of power, I mean, we've all seen this, right? Like an overzealous border agent or, security guard or police officer, or, someone, a school teacher or something. They're given a little bit of power and they kind of get on a power trip and they want to start, abusing that power. And I think that people in the media, not to overly pick on Jake Tapper, because I do think he's a pretty fair journalist compared to a lot of other people over at CNN. But really, you're going to go on TV and rage against people in San Francisco for getting some fresh air, going on the seawall, essentially, the Embarcadero, and going for a nice, pleasant evening stroll and having the audacity to hold hands. I mean, I'm sorry, that's fascism. That is fascism, no matter how you paint it. And I think we've seen a lot of this, a lot of people getting really outraged at other people not quarantining enough. I think everyone should, do your best within your family, within your community to avoid the spread. If you're in any kind of position of power, cancel meetings, cancel, conferences. I was supposed to speak at a number of conferences this fall. I think I've had 5 or 6 speaking gigs that have all fallen through because the events have been canceled, and I was completely for that. I was one of the people kind of leading the front saying, we should really cancel these conferences. We shouldn't do these events that we've planned. It's not a good idea for people to be traveling around the country. It's not a good idea to get hundreds or even thousands of people in a room together before, this thing really exploded. I think we should all take opportunities that we can to encourage friends and family to be cautious and, stay home. If you know someone who is on self-quarantine because they were on a trip, say, and they're back in Canada, offer to go get them groceries if you're not sick yourself. Offer to help them. If you have someone in your family who can't leave the house, someone in your neighborhood, that's civil society. That's when people should step up. But the idea that we should start imposing sanctions, like we should start arresting people and fining people who don't adhere to that, I think that's kind of crossing a line, and that's getting to a position where that's not really a society I want to live in. And, it's hard for people to accept. Like up until a week ago, we all lived in a free society where we could do whatever we wanted. And now all of a sudden we have these like really increasingly strict and authoritarian rules around us. Of course, people are going to push back. Of course they are. And we shouldn't really blame them for that. Right. There was an article that I know I talked about it earlier in the show about how I think we should call it the Chinese virus, or at least the Wuhan virus, because first of all, we shouldn't cower to political correctness. And people who right now are talking, putting out stories and complaining about how it's supposedly racist to call this the Wuhan virus or the China virus, those journalists are doing the bidding work for the communist government of China. There's no other way of putting it. That's exactly what's happening. They are pushing out propaganda created by the Chinese communists, and it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful. Anyone who's complaining or pushing that line of thinking should just basically be called out and ignored. I will read from an article that I just thought was one of the best articles that I have read about this. I love writing that's kind of punchy, kind of funny. This is definitely an example of that. It comes from the National Review, which is an American conservative magazine. It comes from a writer called David Harsanyi, who writes over at National Review. I'll just read a little bit of it because I just think it's so well written and so well put. So he says, the World Health Organization and other sensitive souls have instructed us to stop referring to the new strain of coronavirus as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese flu because of the racist connotations. I'm disinclined to curb my free speech to placate Chinese propagandists, and it seems to me the aversion to those terms is less about racism than about averting blame. But in the spirit of comedy and avoiding disparaging an entire nation, I'm happy to call it the Chi-Com flu moving forward. So I like that quite a bit. He talks about how we always name things after where it originates. So he comes up with a bunch of examples: the West Nile virus, Ebola, the Rocky Mountain spotted fever, etc. He says that, when you come to sort of really overly medical terms like COVID-19 or H1N1, they don't exactly roll off the tip of the tongue. Talks about how we still widely refer to the Spanish flu as a virus that killed around 675,000 Americans and tens of millions around the world in the early 1900s. And it turns out the Spanish flu didn't even originate in Spain. It actually probably originated in China and spread through soldiers fighting in the First World War. Yet we still commonly call it the Spanish flu. So why should we avoid calling this the Chinese flu? And then he goes on and on about how he goes really in depth about how this disease really originated and where it started from and how it is the responsibility of the Chinese regime. So he says, the Chinese regime is perfectly capable of administering an array of authoritarian policies to suppress the rights of its own people, but is apparently unable to exert even mild cultural pressure, warning them that their eating habits can be extraordinarily dangerous and hold the potential of creating massive socioeconomic problems. If the reports are correct, it was in Wuhan's popular wet markets that vendors were selling bats, possibly snakes, that may have caused the coronavirus outbreak. Wet means that the meat sold in these unsanitary stalls was only recently slaughtered. The kind of thing happens quite often, not always in China, of course, but the avian influenza was transmitted to humans from chickens in a wet market. Scientists have been warning for years that the eating of exotic animals in southern China is a time bomb. Acute respiratory syndrome known as SARS also originated in China, probably jumped to humans through bats. I hate to thrust my Western cultural values onto anyone, but maybe it's time we stop eating bats. Okay, this again is from a National Review article called COVID-19 is the Chinese government's curse upon the world. I'll continue reading. It's important to stress that it's not the Chinese people who are the problem. Just look at their success in places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United States. It's the Chinese communists, the Chi-Coms, that are the problem. If the Chinese government spent as much time working on educating its people and regulating dangerous markets as it does on secrecy and propaganda efforts, maybe it wouldn't have to worry as much about diseases being named after it, or about the catastrophic death and economic pain their negligence helps cause. So I thought that was very good. I recommend reading that article, even though I just kind of read it to you, but that's basically the gist of my view on this. China is a very, very bad actor in the world. And because of this, we're basically, shutting down the entire global economy on a risk, on a bet, on a gamble to say, like, hopefully if we all just stay inside, we shut down all the businesses, we make everyone work from home if they can, and if they can't, then we just shut down their businesses. We let the stock market completely tank. Hopefully we won't all die from this disease, but we really don't even know if it will be effective. Some studies are looking and saying that, regardless, we're all still going to catch it. So whether we catch it now or whether we prolong it, and then as soon as all these self-quarantine measures let up, people are going to go outside and they're going to catch it just the same. So, is it really worth shutting down the entire global economy that may or may not ever recover? I mean, we're in pretty scary times right now. I'm not sure that anyone really can predict what's going to happen, which is why the stock market is really going haywire. And, there's really a lot to be concerned about. I don't think that, Justin Trudeau's measures are necessarily going to be of help, but at least they're going in the right direction, compensating people that can't go to work because of government orders. I'm a libertarian. I've said this on my other show that I do with Andrew Lawton. I'm a libertarian when it comes to government spending. I don't think that government needs to take out loads and loads of debt. I don't really believe in having a big social welfare state. I think that people are better off without all that stuff. But when it comes to the government actually actively shutting down the economy, it's their fault that people can't go to work, and therefore it's their responsibility to compensate people for that. But it's not like Canada has a rainy day fund. No, we have to take out more and more debt, which we're going to have to pay back eventually, and that's based on a bet that everything's going to recover and go back to normal in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I'm not really sure that it is. I'm pretty skeptical about that. Let me know what you think about that. And I will be back again with another show, Candice Malcolm Show, next week. In the meantime, my colleague Andrew Lawton and I have been doing a daily show, we call it True North Update, a daily update on everything, all the news with coronavirus, all the latest updates, mostly looking at Canada, but also obviously it's a global pandemic, a global disease. So looking at the global implications as well. Check that out. Our episode today will be up later on this afternoon. So thank you so much for tuning in. And don't forget to check out tnc.news. We have lots and lots of content. I know everyone's kind of bundled up at home, and people are probably getting bored. People, is stuck at home, not able to go out and do the things they normally do. So we are trying to keep you entertained and keep you up to date with all the latest. So go check that out at tnc.news. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.